The other day, I was enjoying a cup of tea and reading my favourite history of my favourite Englishman, The Churchill Factor, by former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. For a treat, I flicked to the beginning to admire the About the Author section, the genius behind the genius, as it were. Only, I accidentally turned to the More by this author page, and there I was bamboozled, bemused, befuddled. On that list, I spied an unfamiliar title, One Comedy of Errors, (fiction), close parentheses. Well, I mused. I'm partial to a good novelle. I requested the novel from my nearest retailer, and readied myself for a sterling read. And what better Englishman to juggle about the nouns and verbs than our very own Boris? He of the Boris bikes. He of the nice blue passports. He of the unnamed blue shampoo.
That's all I know.
He of the... Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Pfeffel.
Pfeffel.
Is that how you... De Pfeffel? Am I saying it right?
Yeah, I think so. Well, nobody... Well, no, we don't know exactly how it's meant to be.
He's a man known for three things: bike riding, an interest in classics, and the Boris noises.
Vegan sausage rolls.
Fairly large multitasking. But that's kind of...
The fact he'd written a novel is something I'd always vaguely been aware of, but never sought out. I'd heard it was a load of old piss in a sock, but I needed to see for myself. So, both to satisfy my own curiosity, and for your entertainment, I dove into Boris Johnson's atrocious novel. Let's set the scene. The year is 2004. The biggest artist on the face of the earth is Usher. The Iraq War has just begun. Based on the 9/11 references in the book, Johnson had to have written 72 Virgins sometime between late 2001 and mid-2003. I couldn't find the original interview, but a 2019 article by the New York Times quoted a 2004 Evening Standard interview where Johnson said he wrote it on holiday, quote, just to see if he could. Throw on top that there was probably minimal editing, and I'd put the writing of this novel squarely in the summer of 2003. Boris Johnson, 39, is MP for Henley, editor of The Spectator, and in the middle of a 4-year affair on his second wife, but more on that later. George W. Bush is President of the United States, and Tony Blair is the Prime Minister. Blair doesn't feature much in the book at all, despite many references to New Labour, but the unnamed president character is almost certainly George W., for reasons that will become clear. I'll admit up front, I honestly wanted to talk about this book as if it were by someone else. Joris Bonson, TV repairman and serial flasher from Croydon. But I couldn't. This is Boris, the novel. He stares out at you from every page of this thing. It just doesn't make sense to talk about it without him. So, without a single further ado... Meet Roger Barlow, a bike-riding, bumbling MP for Cirencester. Yes, that fact is relevant, stay with me. He's at home with his wife, who doesn't get a name, and his 4-year-old son, one of 4 children. And right off the bat, Boris is heading us with lines as bizarre as they are concerning. In reference to Barlow's kid pointing a toy gun at him, quote, "Seldom had there been so exuberant and uninhibited an Oedipus complex." The boy then turns to his mother, in bed, and says, quote, "I'm going to kill Daddy, and then I'm going to marry you." Not even a page down, and we've already been introduced to one of the strangest family dynamics in fiction. Barlow, MP, gets up to check the papers, paying special attention to those, quote, "most likely to have done him in." What for, we don't yet know, but he finds nothing. He has some Weetabix before cycling off towards Westminster. Don't get too comfortable though, because barely 10 pages in, we switch to a new character. This is as good a time as any to mention the POV. We're in third person, one of those round the campfire narrator sorts. There's some direct, "my friends," and "I have my suspicions" later on, so the overall effect is Boris having cornered you at a pub and started reading you his Jack Reacher fanfiction. There's a lot of inner monologuing from whoever the narrator is following, but sometimes between characters we're treated to a bit of warbling from the narrator himself, like Boris has cornered you at a pub and is now reading you bad poetry. On to that new character then. It's the President of the US, in London for a state visit. The president isn't named, but we know he's a Texan and not too tall. In case there's any room for doubt, at the very end the president says, quote, "You sure as hell misunderestimated the great world public," directly referencing one of George W's many famous foot-in-mouth moments. Liquid Bush is having breakfast at an unnamed house in London, eating Weetabix and hanging out with the First Lady. Then the chapter ends, which brings us to this book's pacing problems. Where competent thrillers start the chapters long and shorten them towards the end to match the rising pace of the story, Johnson starts the chapters short and lengthens them as we go, making the beginning disorientating, even without the constant switching of characters, and the ending just a slog. Chapter 2. And I should mention that the chapters are named with military time, as in Chapter 2, 0824 hours. I wouldn't worry about it. Meet William Eric Kinloch Onyema, traffic warden. Eric to the narrator. It's a sunny morning, and while Barlow and the president contend with their Weetabix... Weetabixes? Eric is already on the streets of Westminster, on the hunt for unlawfully parked vehicles. Let's take a look at Eric for a moment. He's a middle-aged man from Nigeria. Not being middle-aged, nor from Nigeria, I can't say whether Boris accurately depicts the inner world of such a man, but I have my doubts. What is interesting is how English is Eric's second language, one he's actively learning. But since Boris is still Boris, the writing is as overwrought as ever, so we get bizarre sections like, quote, "He searched for his new favourite word. It was on the tip of his tongue. He just confirmed its rough area of meaning with his teachers at the Euro Language School in Peckham Rye. He looked at the happy brown river, winking beneath the bituminous scum." In case you were wondering, the word he was searching for was buxom, an essential for all English speakers, I'm sure you'll agree. "It was going to be a buxom day," Eric later declares. I'm not sure having a black man as a character gives Boris the right to drop so many N-bombs as he does. I am certain introducing an Arab man doesn't validate the use of another N-word, now appearing on screen. Johnson's attitude to slurs seems to be it's fine so long as they're too obscure or old-fashioned to be recognised, as in those now appearing on screen. No, I'm not going to read them out. Slurs aside, Eric gets some lines that are just classic awful writing. Quote, "His delighted eye scanned the landscape, dappley and wavy and branchy." Don't your eyes just love a dappley, branchy landscape? I know mine do. On top of this, some of Eric's dialogue is written phonetically, as in, quote, "De-law is de-law," which is, something. Anyway, Eric the traffic warden is on the prowl. He spots an ambulance parked on a single yellow line. We'll ignore for a moment that nobody would tow an ambulance, no matter how badly parked, because of the small fact that it's a goddamn ambulance. But that's just what Eric does. But before we can witness this thrilling parking violation action, we again switch to a new character, or rather, a set of characters. Meet a group of 4 Muslim men, our terrorists. There's Dean, a young English boy, Haroun and Habib, 2 interchangeable men of Lebanese descent who only seem to matter when one of them needs to find a toilet, and the leader, Jones the Bomb. I think his actual name is Mr. the Bomb. It's got a capital B and that's how he's always referred to, so I suppose his career as a terrorist couldn't have come soon enough. There's a lot to unpack about these guys, from the Arabic dialogue written phonetically to the constant mention of their, quote, dark skin. And that's even before we get into the mountains of backstory. But let's leave that for later and press on. Having eaten a full breakfast in a Westminster cafe, the 4 men take turns to use the bathroom. Mr. the Bomb sees Eric walk by the window and runs after him. Somehow, by the time he makes it out of the cafe, the tow truck has arrived and the ambulance is being lifted into the air. So, either the traffic wardens in this universe are borderline magical, or Jones the Bomb walks very, very slowly. Mr. the Bomb rallies his men, and they start arguing with Eric. Again, ignore the fact that an ambulance being driven by anyone who is not a medical professional is an instant red flag. There's no time to question it, however, because the chapter's over, and we're on to someone new. Honestly, it's amazing how Boris manages to make these non-events so confusing. It wasn't until trying to summarise the chapters after the fact that I realised just how much of this frenetic waffle at the start doesn't end up mattering in the slightest. Chapter 3, and we're with a new focal character, number 7 for those of you keeping notes. Deputy Assistant Commissioner Purnell is the man in charge of security for the President's visit. Purnell is one of those background characters in an 80s movie who looks at a bleeping light and says, "My God," before the real protagonists show up. He has no character and barely any role in the plot. I'm only mentioning him to demonstrate just how many useless characters we're introduced to throughout the course of this story. and I'm even cutting a few out who are not worth bringing up. All we learn from Purnell now is that the Americans want one of their own, a sniper by the name of Pickle, on the roof of the House of Commons. Yes, that is an important character, bear with me. For less than a page, we jump back to Roger Barlow as he cycles through Westminster. Why? I have no idea. All we get is some more fretting that his wife will see what's in the Evening Standard, either that day or the day after. This is Johnson's attempt at foreshadowing, so stay tuned to find out what that's all about. Spoiler, it's dumb as all hell. Chapter 4, and we're back with Eric the Traffic Warden as he argues with the 4 men. Chapter 5, back to Purnell as he thrillingly reads a folder. Chapter 6, look, there's a lot of filler in this thing. It doesn't get any better. Let me skip forward to the next bit that actually matters. Okay. Barlow happens to come across the ambulance as it's being towed. He sees the altercation and thinks, quote, "A classic scene of our modern, vibrant, multicultural society. A group of asylum seekers in dispute with a Nigerian traffic warden. Poor bleeders. They would have to find the thick end of £200 just to spring their motor. How many windscreens would they have to wash to earn that back?" End quote. Barlow approaches and attempts to help Jones get his ambulance back, but both Jones and Eric are hostile. Every blurb and review I've seen for this book says something to the effect of, "The fictional Boris Johnson helped stop a second 9/11. I'm not sure if I read the same book, but the furthest Barlow goes to stopping the terrorist plot is opportunistically jumping in after it's already foiled, mostly out of vanity. But we get ahead of ourselves again. Barlow pedals off, and Jones the Bomb stabs Eric the Traffic Warden and bundles him to the back of the ambulance. The tow truck operator is a Serbian man called Dragan Panic. Panic? As with every non-English character in the story, Dragan is a stereotype of his nationality. He's dressed in a tracksuit, quote, "tracky bums," and runs away from the murderers, quote, "as though with every yard he expected a bullet in his back from the Kosovo Liberation Army." Eric too, before he got stabbed, had a line like this, quote, "The scars on his cheeks denoted that he was a prince of the royal blood in the Hausa tribe, and it was only the evil of primogeniture that debarred him from substantial estates outside Lagos." It kind of negates any research Johnson might have done into certain migrant groups, when the people from those groups aren't given any identity beyond the broad strokes of their ethnicity. Incidentally, this section is one of my favourite lines in the whole book. Dragan goes running looking for help, because this is a time when only the rich and powerful could afford Nokias. He runs towards a building site, quote, "He stamped and grunted as fast as his Reeboks would carry him." Genius. Let's skip forward through 20-odd pages of nothing, and in the meantime, let me tell you about one of Johnson's many linguistic quirks. Here are some words that appear in the book, and you see how many of them you can define. Prurient, acratic, saurian, riparian, chuntered, yomp, quotidian. If you got one, then you did better than me, and that's only a handful out of dozens. With any other author, I'd say they got a little too thesaurus happy, but with Johnson, I suspect this is just the way he thinks regular people talk. He used the word whence like it's still in fashion. Besides, what thesaurus written this century would suggest a word like chuntered? Then there's the instances where he just invents new words. Pandemonians, as in a scene of pandemonium. Prangmeister, I think meaning someone who often crashes cars. And my favourite, smegmatic, describing a man's crotch area. Is this arrogance? Him thinking his power with words overrules the need for a dictionary? Or is it gleeful abandon? You decide. We rejoin Roger Barlow on his bike at the security gate outside the Houses of Parliament. He's forgotten his clearance pass, so he calls his assistant, Cameron McLean. Cameron is a young American woman come to the UK to work as Barlow's assistant. Johnson doesn't actually do a terrible job in characterising her, if it's a bit more tell than show. She's a hardline authoritarian neocon, traditional values, anti-abortion, the works. Cameron is also beautiful, with, quote, glossy evangelical skin and lustrous eyes. She's never once referred to without being called beautiful or exceptionally good looking. In case you're wondering, Boris Johnson did know David Cameron, the former Prime Minister and Brexit cock-up man, while writing this book. They'd gone to Oxford together, and both been part of the infamous Bullingdon Club. Why Johnson decided to name his sexy assistant after his younger, slimmer friend is a mystery. It isn't strictly relevant, but an interesting piece of trivia I saw while researching is that this picture of Oxford's Bullingdon Club of 1987 was actually banned from being shown in the media when Oxford's photographers filed copyright claim. To get around this, BBC journalist Michael Crick had the idea of commissioning a painting of the photograph. The artist they got for the job, Rona Marsden, did it over a few days and ended up making some tea towels out of it, so that's a nice little lesson on how to get around a copyright claim. Anyway, Cameron soon appears with Roger's security pass, and they both continue towards the Houses of Parliament. Then we switch between some of the other characters for a while. Purnell looking for the ambulance they've been tipped off is involved in a terrorist plot. The terrorists themselves driving through Westminster eating hummus. Yes, that happens. And Dragon Panitz giving up and trying to get help from the, quote, asylum-seeking Bricky at the building site and finding a police station. The only important takeaway from this part is that the ambulance full of terrorists keeps popping up around Westminster with a musical sting like it's in Jaws. So, we're almost 100 pages and 17 chapters in, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that nothing has happened. A lot of people have been introduced, someone got stabbed, but nothing that wouldn't fit on a postcard. Now, Johnson decides, is just the time for a whole slab of backstory for the youngest of the terrorists, Dean. Dean is the only one of the 4 Muslim men to have grown up in the UK. In the view of his fellow terrorists, quote, he seemed to have absorbed far too much of the risk aversion of the modern British male. According to Haroon and Habib, he's only included in the terrorist cell because of tokenism. Quote, it was political correctness gone mad. Who knew, back in 2004, even the suicide bombers were complaining about the woke. The first thing we learn about Dean's past is that he was born exactly 9 months after Thatcher's last election victory. A beautiful and moving detail that brings the scene to life. His mother was a sex worker, and baby Dean gets put up for adoption, and, quote, since he was only the faintest coffee colour, he was fostered with a white family. The Faulkners live in Wolverhampton, and Dean has an idyllic childhood, attending grammar school and showing an early talent for, checks notes, water polo. What? Does Boris Johnson think that kids in state schools play water polo? There's a similar line later on where a middle-class woman says she's been going to a local swimming pool for daily scuba diving lessons. Combine this with some truly baffling uses of slang, and you begin to realise just how out of touch this man is. Moments like a sex worker advertising with the line, quote, I'll be Greek to your Roman, or a down-to-earth celebrity chef saying, what's the problem we've got here, folks? It's people everywhere hating America, innit? An alien could do a better job approximating the dialogue of everyday people. While still a teenager, Dean's foster parents get into a feud with a neighbour for stupid reasons, which somehow results in Dean accidentally burning down the man's garage/cheese manufacturing lab in an attempt to please his parents. No, none of this is properly explained, put your hand down. Dean admits to the accidental arson in a fit of tears, which makes his foster father, the man who raised him from an infant, smack him on the side of the head and call him a, quote, stupid little C-word. No, not that C-word, the slur is on screen. Those of you interested in psychology can unpack Johnson writing the generic dad archetype as a man who, after raising a child for almost 20 years, is still not able to love them. Moving on, we now jump back to... Oh, hello Klaus, glad you could join us. How far are we through the story? Let me see, 100 pages out of 400. So yeah, we're just racing through this page turner. Luckily, however, the middle half doesn't matter so much. You can feel Johnson running out of stamina at the 20% mark with a screech and a clunk, so what follows is even more clumsy than before. Here's a condensed version of the events of the wet cement and styrofoam sandwich that is the middle of this book. Marlowe's assistant Cameron monologues for an extended period about her trouble dating since coming to London. Englishmen, in her opinion, are too frigid, none of them wanting to, quote, take her firmly in his arms and give a girl the time of day. I just can't read these quotes without sounding like Boris. She worries that, quote, perhaps her hymen would actually regrow. Thank God she finally meets a proper man, Dr. Adam Swallow. He's a man's man. Firm, attractive, certain. He also studied in Balliol College at Oxford, Boris Johnson's own college. What a happy coincidence. Cameron has this to say on the subject of men. I'll read it in full just so you get the true effect. Quote, obviously she needed an alpha male. she needed an authority figure to supplant her father. Henry, Hank, or Buster McLean, was an alpha male so alpha he would have been awarded a congratulatory first by the examiners in advanced virility. End quote. Cameron's hunky boy, however, turns out to be working with the terrorists. Gasp. He's told Cameron that they're 4 TV men from a foreign news outlet who were denied press passes because of their race. The eventual underdeveloped twist to this twist is that Dr. Swallow was himself lied to. He thought the men wanted to gain access to Westminster Hall to publicly confront the president about the American government's human rights abuses. Now, I know this all sounds very complex and interwoven. Golf clap, Mr. Johnson, but hold those palms, because none of it actually matters. The terrorists do eventually make it into Westminster Hall, but the way they do has nothing to do with the passes they obtain from Dr. Swallow, via Cameron, via Barlow. It reads as if Johnson wrote each of these story threads individually and worked out how they would fit together after the fact. There's no consequences, no cause and effect. You never feel like the story is progressing. It's just bizarre events, one after the other, until something important but unrelated happens. Speaking of which, it's time for more of Dean's backstory. And another weird and problematic line. Quote, "The interesting thing about his slur looks," he decided, "was that he didn't look slur. As ever, slurs on screen." I know I mentioned these two before, but I think the context really adds something. Dean starts going about with some ne'er-do-wells during his community service. Honestly, I didn't mind this section. There were bits where the boys would prefer to remove the graffiti off gravestones than move on to the next job of scraping chewing gum from the pavements. So, night after night, Dean and company returned to the graveyard to spray new graffiti to replace the stuff they'd just cleaned off that day. It's clever and well told, all one page of it, before it's back to pages about taxpayer spending and Dean's days working at a supermarket. The only important takeaway here is that Dean falls in love with an attractive checkout girl called Vanessa, but uh-oh, Vanessa sleeps with Dean's best friend, causing him to morph, werewolf style, into a furious incel. But then it turns out Vanessa is no ordinary checkout girl, but an undercover reporter for The Guardian doing a piece about life on the breadline. All along, this attractive woman with the good body was actually called Lucy Goodbody. Huh. Filled with yet more rage, Dean burns down the local Guardian headquarters. It's glossed over how this teenager goes from accidental arson for the sake of his parents to firebombing a newspaper office. Dean ends up in a young offenders institution, and it's there he's introduced to Jones the Bomb. In a better written novel, this could have been a challenging comment on the pipeline that leads teenagers from minor offences to a life of crime and religious fundamentalism. But Johnson writes this section more like a villain origin story. It took him almost 20 years, but despite being raised in a middle-class family, he can't escape the destiny dictated by his race. I mean, all it took was for a girl he had a crush on to sleep with his friend, and he jumped straight to arson. Remember the name Pickle? I told you it'll be important. Jason Pickle is the American marksman positioned on the roof of the Houses of Parliament. With him is an English sniper, Indira Natu. She, quote, had huge eyes, rosy lips, and tiny, delicate hands. Is it nitpicking to mention that she's referred to by her first name, while Pickle is referred to by his second? It's the same with Cameron McLean and Roger Barlow. Maybe that's nitpicking. While idly chewing the cud with their high-powered snipers aimed at the anti-American protesters below, Pickle decides the time is right to recount a PTSD flashback of his time in Baghdad. It goes like this. Stationed outside a military base in Baghdad, Pickle is approached by an English reporter by the name of Barry White. Fun fact, the real Barry White died in July of 2003, just when Johnson would be writing this scene. I can't begin to understand that fact. Fictional reporter Barry White is there to write an article on the US occupation. While trying to get Pickle to let him into the compound, I guess White was just wandering around Baghdad alone beforehand, a car approaches. 5 Iraqi men are inside. Pickle calls in English for the car to stop. It doesn't, so he raises his weapon and shoots, causing the fuel tank to explode, engulfing the 5 men in a ball of flames. Mr. White instantly starts drafting an article about the incident, writing that he heroically tried to stop Pickle, even though he hid in a ditch. Pickle has a paragraph of regret about the 5 men he just murdered, and then we move on. More words were given to the burning down of that guy's cheese lab. I know you could say this about most of the story threads in this book, but I just don't know what to make of this. Is Pickle meant to be the villain? Was his murder of the 5 men meant to be justified? Barry White's article includes a line about them not speaking English and being unarmed, so Pickle was in the wrong, but he also lies about being courageous while he hid in a ditch, so he's not meant to be taken seriously? Who is at fault here? What are we meant to make of these characters? Why are there no consequences? Why is it glossed over that one of the central heroes of the story killed 5 innocent men? Or do the lives of non-English speaking Iraqis just not count? Christ! I guess that's one way to avoid taking a political stance. Just be as confusing as possible so people get what they want out of it. It's very nearly abstract art. Right, what's next? Calling someone a pikey, a vehement defense of fox hunting. Oh, a line calling US servicemen, quote, bovine robocops. The amazing line, mega-titted 6-footer. No, I'm not going to give that context. Okay, here we are. 70 pages later. I'm skipping over some faffing about, some side plots about the protesters that go nowhere, and this protracted scene where Barlow phones up the journalist who plans to release a story about him and verbally assaults her. We rejoin our ambulance terrorists as they arrive at Derby Gate, one of the entrances to Westminster Hall. They have a bit of playful banter about who has to wear the smallest suicide vest, before grabbing a bunch of TV equipment and heading out. I'm really not sure what the point of the ambulance was if they planned to masquerade as a foreign TV crew. Maybe driving an ambulance was on Jones the Bomb's bucket list. I know why Boris made it that way, for the breathtaking, well, breath-having, final act. Having collected their passes from Dr. Swallow earlier, the bad boys make their way into an underground tunnel that leads to the hall. And here we encounter one of those story not quite fitting together bits I was talking about. Do they flash their passes and head on in? Is there an issue with the passes? Do they, as I've seen some analysis comment, use the PC gone mad culture to guilt the police into not stopping them? None of the above. They wander underground, then are accosted by a policeman who wants to see their security passes. For reasons that escape me, they don't just whip out the passes they went to the trouble of getting. Instead, they make their excuses and leave back the way they came. I really hope I'm bringing across the sheer weight of anticlimax. What exciting threads do get set up and chewed over for chapters only fall away from the story without payoff. It's like riding a roller coaster that just takes you slowly uphill, then dumps you out at the gift shop. So all that stuff with the passes, with Cameron's boyfriend working with the terrorists, the tension over whether their passes would fool the police, all of it leads climactically to Jones the Bomb telling his men, hey, why don't we just turn on the sirens, right? Then drive up to Westminster Hall. If the book wasn't over 400 pages long, I'd say Johnson was worried about it being too short. Given its length, I'm convinced Boris just wanted a way to involve his Mary Sue author insert. Even with the whole security pass rigmarole, Barlow is barely connected to the story. Johnson must have realised that cutting the chaff would have also cut his OC Do Not Steal. So, while our 4 hardened terrorists thrillingly get in and out of their car, Westminster Hall fills up with foreign dignitaries, members of parliament and media types, but Roger Barlow is nowhere to be found. In the background, he managed to piece together that there was an ambulance going around full of men with bad intent. How does he figure this out? Well, a man at the pass office mentions offhand that his assistant, that's Cameron McLean, requested 4 passes in his name for a foreign media crew. Somehow this translates to, those men you saw by that ambulance earlier are out to attack the president. Maybe he just saw the foreign names and assumed as much, I don't know. Roger Barlow leaves the pass office just as the blaring ambulance approaches. To his horror, the checkpoint guards stand aside and the terrorists speed towards the hall. Apparently, it didn't occur to any of these international security professionals that someone inside this event might, at some point, need medical assistance. Allow me, once again, to quote, do up, said the ambulance. Woo up, said the ambulance. And my favourite, nee nor nee, went the ambulance. Truly the Shakespeare of our time. Finally, we're at the place we all knew this story was leading to. the terrorists gaining access to the hall during the president's speech. God, if that premise doesn't say it all. Understandably, you might expect that we're nearing the end of the book. We still need a climax and a resolution, but we've got to be getting up there in terms of page count, right? Wrong, you silly moo. No Smarties for you. Johnson splits the book into 3 parts. The first was called The Trojan Ambulance, the second, The Special Relationship, and the third, I Come to Bury Caesar, just in case you thought this beach read wasn't pretentious enough. So far, we've made it to part 2, exactly halfway through the book. Perhaps Johnson spent too much time studying classic Greek plays at Oxford. Classically speaking, plays often had the climax halfway through the runtime, because those Greeks were big into symmetry. Not being a very good writer, however, in the second half Johnson really has to make like wall insulation and fill the space with fluff. Don't worry, I'll do my best to condense it. Part 2 begins with Jason Pickle. He's got his sights trained on the 4 men getting out of the ambulance, heading towards the hall. He's ready to pull the trigger. Then, all at once, and that's to say, over 10 pages of filler, 3 things distract him. First, Roger Barlow runs into his line of sight, again only making things worse. Seriously, who read this book and decided it was about Barlow saving the president? Second, Pickle catches sight of a familiar face. Strolling nearby, it's none other than Barry White, the journalist from that fateful day in Baghdad. Pickle decides to ignore his orders and trains his sights on the innocent journalist's head. Third, Indira Nathu, the British sniper, attacks Pickle. She reported to her superiors that Pickle was acting unstable, and so she's under strict orders to subdue him and disarm him. I suppose we're not meant to notice that Nathu's superiors are, at that moment, standing in the same room as Pickle's superiors. Nathu and Pickle tussle on the roof. Pickle wraps his legs around her and goes to shoot the journalist. From this moment on, how would you write this scene? Maybe Nathu's hands clasp around the knife strapped to Pickle's ankle. Or perhaps Pickle lined up the shot, but his finger hesitated over the trigger. Here's how Boris chose to immortalise this scene. Quote, except that Indira, dazed and winded beneath him, chose that moment to fight back. Nothing could be worse, she decided, than the smegmatic oblivion of her current position. Rotating her head, she bit what she took to be Jason Pickle's inner thigh, but what was, in fact, his left testicle. Youk! Said Jason Pickle. I have no words. In case you're wondering, that's the last time Barry White comes into the story. Gone, but not forgotten. In the confusion, the 4 men manage to get into the building, still carrying their TV equipment for some reason. Barlow runs in after them, and Johnson makes sure to tell us that he certainly could have overtaken them in a straight sprint, but he's tired, and he gets himself tangled in a bunch of TV cables, somehow. Next, we're treated to the full, unsummarised content of the president's speech, which includes some choice commentary on the Israel-Palestine conflict that I'm not even going to touch, while the 4 men creep along the side of the crowd, somehow unseen by the dozens of armed Secret Service officials in the room. Barlow sneaks after them, apparently intending to seize all 4 of them at once like Mr. Fantastic, but an old acquaintance, the aforementioned celebrity chef, recognises him and tells him to sit down. This Barlow does, because saving the President of the US is pretty important, but he doesn't want to make a whole song and dance about it. Jones the Bomb makes it on stage and handcuffs himself to the President, declaring that his suicide vest is wired up to a heart rate sensor, so they better not shoot him. Is this giving anyone else Stephen King vibes? It's giving me Stephen King vibes. But Mr. Owlman, you cry. We have to be near the end now. What more could possibly happen? Ha ha ha, oh you. That's Baron Mr. Owlman. And who told you to come out of the basement? Yeah. It turns out 3 members of the crowd are also working with Jones. There's 2 unnamed Arab men and the girlfriend of the French ambassador, Benedictine Al-Walibi. Because this was sort of foreshadowed earlier, in one line by Purnell, I guess we're not supposed to question how these terrorists got into the hall and managed to stash a bunch of fully automatic weapons in the floor. It feels like a minor gripe, but why did Johnson introduce 2 extra unnamed men when he had 3 besides Jones he already introduced? It might have been interesting to see Dean go around the hall collecting mobile phones. Maybe some people recognise his accent, maybe he tries to apologise. Anything would have been better than our 3 terrorists with actual names standing off to one side like they're giving a group presentation. One of the unnamed terrorists comes to collect Barlow's phone. Barlow says he doesn't have a mobile phone, calling them, quote, technological Judases. It turns out Barlow had recently pocket-called his wife while with a woman called Eulalie. Eulalie, with whom, quote, that ghastly reporter from the Mirror was now taking such an interest. So, we the reader naturally assume Barlow's having an affair. However, at the end of this story, in a single line, Barlow's inner monologue reveals this isn't the case. In fact, Eulalie is the name of a lingerie shop in which Barlow agreed to invest, and the reporter mistakenly thinks this shop is the front for a brothel. What makes this plot twist truly insane is that while Johnson was writing this, he was lying to his wife, the press, and his own party about having an affair with the journalist Petronella Wyatt. He called the allegations, quote, complete balderdash, and, quote, an inverted pyramid of piffle. The only reason the affair came to light in 2004 was because Wyatt's mother, Lady Verushka Wyatt, spoke to the Sunday Times. Johnson had promised to leave his wife for her daughter, she claimed. The whole fiasco cost Johnson his front bench position, and very nearly ended his political career. So this thread of the novel, everything about Barlow being maligned in the press, about his wife's suspicions being unfounded, about his seemingly suspect behaviour having a reasonable explanation, it's all to reinforce the idea that he wasn't, at that moment, having an affair that he was in fact having. What you're reading when you read this section is Johnson trying to gaslight the public, the reader, and to a lesser extent, his wife. Anyway, cheese. There's a pungent cheese motif that runs throughout this novel. The cheese lab, cheese metaphors, the nationality of cheese, the French are referred to as cheese eaters throughout. When Jones the Bomb opens up the floor to hear the opinions of those gathered in Westminster Hall, he calls upon the celebrity chef sat beside Barlow, who declares, quote, what you get from politicians like Roger is just like American cheese, processed and heat-treated to the point of macrobiotic extinction, and what you get from me is raw, unpasteurized. Jones approves, and this chef's speech goes on for pages and pages. The topic for debate is this: should the prisoners detained without trial in Guantanamo Bay be extradited to their own countries for a fair trial? If it hadn't hit you before, you'll now realise just how wildly the tone jumps from page to page. Meanwhile, Pickle the Sniper re-enters our story. Having gotten away from Natu, he decides to get into the hall via a hole in the roof. It's a bit unclear, but I think he slips into some sort of gantry or rafter system, giving him a view down onto the crowd. Trying to climb back upwards to get his gun that got caught on a loose beam, Westminster Hall being famously derelict, Pickle's foot knocks something loose that falls into the crowd. What was this loosened object? Some clod of earth? A brick? A piece of statue? 880 words, yes I checked, to describe that it was one of Henry VIII's tennis balls, volleyed so hard that it got stuck in the ceiling of the hall, only to get knocked loose some 500 years later. I cannot overstate how out of place, how much of a slog this part was. Quote, one can imagine the scene. It's a bright morning in the springtime of his reign, the sun strong enough outside to fill the hall with blue smoky light. Enter Henry, determined to work up an appetite for swan stuffed with goose stuffed with vole. And it goes on. Good shot, my liege, claims the courtier, but no amount of flattery will coax Henry's ball into the service court. The king is beginning to go red. A certain jowly savagery is creeping over his features. Boris, if you wanted to write bad history fanfic, you could have... no, I suppose he did do that. Oh, well, never mind. But do you want to know what the worst part of it is? The ball falling into the crowd doesn't even matter. Jones sees it, decides to take the president off into a side room with Dean, Dr. Swallow and Cameron, but then he comes back later with nothing changed. Well, I suppose he did blow up Harun. What happens is, Dean says he's done, marches off, so Jones the Bomb pulls out his phone detonator. The whole building rings with an explosion. Is Dean okay? Sure. Jones decided to blow up Harun, who was, at that moment, off in the bathroom. Why? Your guess is as good as mine. The ending reminded me of that game you play in bad creative writing workshops, where each person has to write a line of a story one after the other, and the result is just non sequitur after non sequitur. For some reason, the many cameras televising the president's speech are still airing the hostage situation as it unfolds. Jones the Bomb now decides to call on the people of the world to vote on whether they think the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay should be extradited for trial. People from all over the world call in, maybe to their governments? Or maybe to their local news station? Who's to say? Not me, that's for sure. In the UK, people start flooding the BBC of all places. What will be the outcome? Will it matter to the plot? What do you think? Meanwhile... Wait. You're just going to move on from the world vote? You're not going to comment on how many, presumably English-speaking countries respond? You're not going to analyse the ramifications of the split vote in South Korea? Meanwhile, the chiefs of security have had a brainwave. Why not shoot Jones the bomb with a tranquilizer? Technically, it was a female detective called Camilla who came up with the plan, but Purnell takes the idea and calls her darling, in either a curious recognition of the gender bias in the British police or a wildly tone-deaf joke. A helicopter lowers a man onto the roof of the hall who finds Pickle and gives him the tranquilizer darts. Now, I know what you're thinking. Where in the gosh darn world is Roger Barlow? The blurb promised me he'd be bumbling about saving the day. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but he's neither bumbling about nor saving the day. He sat exactly where the TV chef pulled him before Jones the bomb handcuffed himself to the president. The premise of the book is practically false advertising. Finally, we get to the ending. After a bit more filler, of course. Did you really like that TV chef's monologue about cheese and people everywhere hating America in it? Well, you're in luck, because he gets a second speech. Open wide. Pickle loads the tranquilizer darts, takes aim, and fires. But Jones moves out of the way at the last moment, pulling the president into the line of fire. The dart jabs into the top of the president's head, and within a few seconds, he's unconscious. "You fools!" says Jones like he's a fucking G.I. Joe villain. He pulls out his phone detonator and starts dialing. For reasons unknown, I can't keep saying for some reason, I'm getting bored of it, Pickle decides he can't just take another shot, but instead he must throw himself from the rafters, breaking his leg. Jones the bomb watches Pickle land, pauses, and then shoots him, with, I must say, masterful comedic timing. This bullet to the chest doesn't kill Pickle, however, but before Mr. the Bomb can get off another shot, Roger Barlow steps in and kicks the terrorist's elbow. Jones tries to shoot Barlow, but his gun jams. So, finally, Barlow saved the day. Well, saved the man who saved the day from getting shot. Well, I suppose saved the man who accidentally shot the president before jumping from the rafters and breaking his leg from getting shot. I suppose he saved the man who accidentally shot the president before jumping from the rafters and breaking his leg from getting shot twice. "You idiot MP," says Jones. How Jones knows that Barlow is an MP, I can't tell you. But what number did Jones the Bomb dial? Who actually saves the day? Do you remember Eric, the parking attendant? The guy who was stabbed, bundled into the ambulance and forgotten about? Turns out, he's alive, and there's a big bomb in the ambulance. And Eric woke up at the last minute and sort of accidentally pulled out the wires just before it exploded. Who knew bomb disposal was so easy? Then Westminster Hall is flooded with abseiling special forces, like it's that scene from Monsters, Inc. The terrorists are arrested. Cameron confirms that her boyfriend had nothing to do with the actual terrorism part of the plot, though I guess he's still lied to her face multiple times. The narrator reveals Barlow wasn't having an affair after all, and all along it was those damn journalists out to get him. It's a happy ending. Barlow cycles home. But Johnson isn't letting you get out of here without one more vaguely concerning line. We all remember his weird, eatable 4-year-old at the beginning, don't we? Well, he gets a shout out at the very last sentence of the book. Quote, "You were on TV," said the 4-year-old, and climbed onto his knee with the others. They all daubed him with tomato ketchup so he could be like the other people they'd seen on TV. End quote. What the fuck? Who ends a book like that? The protagonist's children cover him in ketchup to make him look like, I assume, the American soldier with his compound leg fracture and a bullet through his chest? Who writes like this? Who thinks like this? To spend a day in this man's mind is a punishment I would not wish on my worst enemy. I didn't get a chance to fit this in anywhere else, so let me finish up by talking about Johnson's female characters. You'll remember Cameron McLean and Indira Natu, though I hesitate to call Natu a character since the full extent of her involvement in the story is what I've outlined above. There's Benedictine Al-Walibi, the girlfriend of the French ambassador who turns out to be working with Jones, Lucy Goodbody, the undercover journalist who happens to be in Westminster Hall to no great effect, the unnamed First Lady, as well as an older peeress in Westminster Hall referred to as Old Iron Pants. That's 6, ignoring some background characters. Would you believe me if I told you 4 of these women burst out crying at some point in the finale? Old Iron Pants not only starts crying, but also wets herself, which is interesting. The imperious First Lady, the noble peeress, the young staunch conservative, the morally ambiguous undercover reporter, all of them burst into tears under the pressure. I wouldn't mind if all of the characters started weeping and wetting themselves. Maybe the reader would feel the weight of the threat, but all the men weather the situation with stoic resignation and a few quips. It's a pretty poor showing for characters across the board, but Johnson's female characterization stoops to the level of those breathy dames found in cheap westerns. All of this comes from a man renowned for treating women like accessories, trophies to be won by his charisma. Without going too far into the realm of judging the man over the work, it does say a lot that when googling how many children Johnson has, the answer you get is anywhere between 7 and 9. The Guardian has reported a contemporary of Johnson in the Bullingdon Club at Oxford as saying that during club events they, quote, always hired whores. Prostitutes were paid extra by members who wanted to use them. In the same article, an unidentified woman who acted as the club's recruiter while Johnson was a member said, quote, the characteristics he displayed at Oxford, entitlement, aggression, amorality, lack of concern for others, are still there, dressed up in a contrived, jovial image. It's a mask to sanitize some ugly features. This last point is what really pushed this book from bad to vile. The clear lack of compassion that often borders on aggression, manifested first as misogyny, then racism, then hatred for the working class, then xenophobia, painted over with this veneer of bumbling innocence. You've heard the details of the story. Would anyone, read these details of torture, arson, attempted murder, political tension, and terrorist attacks written less than 3 years after 9/11 and call this a comedy of errors? At times I felt dirty for reading it. I certainly feel dirty reading it aloud. So we come to the question that constantly hung over me while I read 72 Virgins, which was this. Why? Why did Johnson write this? Who is this book for? It certainly isn't for people who want a punchy thriller. The chapter about Henry VIII's tennis matches tell us that. It's not for anyone who cares about the issues surrounding the war on terror post 9/11, because Johnson never discusses them in detail or takes a real stance. And besides, the novel surrounding it is too convoluted to tackle any of those issues directly. So if it wasn't for the enjoyment of the reader, why did Johnson write it? There was one section in particular that gave me a clue to the answer. I skipped over it in the summary because it didn't matter to the plot, but a large chunk of the second half involves a group of government officials standing off to one side in Westminster Hall. We read about the Speaker and his, quote, old ebony staff surmounted by a lion, which had been the mark of his office since it was created by deed pattern in 1350, end quote. And about the gentleman usher of the Black Rod, and the office of the Lord Chamberlain, and through the stupor this part put me into, I realised, this isn't a story for me. It's not a story for you. It's not a story for anyone. It exists for one reason, and one reason only, to satisfy Boris Johnson's ego. In his 2014 biography of Winston Churchill, The Churchill Factor, Johnson tries to draw parallels between him and his hero. He points to Churchill's oratory skills, to his American origin, to the contemporaneous claims that Churchill was unprincipled. Churchill was also a novelist. Taking all this into account, we see what 72 Virgins truly is. It's not a book written to challenge, excite, upset, shock, or move the reader. It's not an exploration of the medium. It's not here to entertain you, to whisk you away, or to keep you on the edge of your seat. It's not a manifesto to further his politics, a la Atlas Shrugged, because Johnson has no political beliefs, apart from a vague sense that health and safety regulation has gone too far, and that immigrants are bad. It's not even a potboiler scribbled out to make money. What 72 Virgins is a semi-talented debater shitting out a novel to further his image as an intellectual, a wise leader, then using his connections and wealth to force it through publication just to feed his insatiable ego. Bad novels can be worth your time. They are products of love, signs of someone taking a risk, daring to fail and learn. At the very least, a bad novel can throw the good ones into sharp relief. But Boris Johnson's 72 Virgins is one of the few novels about which I can say with absolute certainty the world is a worse place for it having been written.